Hello, my name is Stanford Gibson. I'm the Sediment Transport Specialist at HEC, and this is part of a series of videos on troubleshooting a sediment transport model in HEC-RAS. In this video, we're going to look at three very specific errors that I see in a lot of models, particularly with respect to entering sediment gradations into the sediment model. One of the things that my kids and I have been doing during this time that we're all kind of sheltering in place during COVID is that I've been teaching them chess. And so we've been spending some time on the chess YouTubes, and I feel like this is similar to some of the videos in that genre. If this was a chess video, it would be like 3 classic blunders that intermediate players run into during the first 10 moves of their opening, or something like that. It's something that happens often enough with people who have spent some time with the model that I feel like I want to highlight these things as not the best practices. And so there are 2 places that you have to put sediment gradations into any HEC-RAS sediment model. The first is in the bed. You need to define the gradation of the bed. You need to do that at every cross-section. It doesn't necessarily need to be a unique gradation at every cross-section. You can interpolate or you can drag them to represent more than one cross-section, but you need gradations to each cross-section. And then you also need to specify the gradation of the flux, the gradation of the sediment load coming in from your upstream boundary conditions. And of course, you would need to do the same thing at tribs and things like that. But definitely every model needs bed gradations and gradations of the load coming into their model. So if you're not familiar with the sediment transport model in RAS, go ahead and check out some of the introductory videos that will walk you through the process of putting these data in. But this is the sediment transport editor, and there are really 2 places that you define gradations. In the initial conditions and transport parameters, this is where you define your bed gradations associated with each cross-section. You create your bed gradations here, and then you can create as many of them as you'd like. Here we only have 1. And then you come here and you select them, and all the variables are there. These are your bed gradations. Then the second place, you'll define the flux gradations under your boundary condition. And here we've got a rating curve. You can also do this as a time series. But the most common way is to have a flow load rating curve where the flows and the loads or the concentrations are in the first 2 rows. We have a feature here where you can switch between flows and concentrations pretty easily. But you can see that then once you have these loads, you have to define the gradational breakdown of each one of them. Right, so let's start with the first common gradational error. The first common error that I see when people are putting gradations into RAS is that they will skip grain classes. Okay, so let's just take this gradation here and let's copy it. That's what this button does right here, and we'll call this skip. And so something I'll see is that people will go in and only put in the gradations that they have SIB data for. And maybe they don't have SIB data for every grain class in the log base 2 scale. And so they'll go in and they'll skip those grain classes. And at the very least, that's going to cause your model to underperform. And at the worst, it's going to cause some numerical artifacts that will really determine your results in a negative way. The first reason that it'll cause your model to underperform is if you have any sort of depositional model, if you have a reservoir that's depositing, the shape of your delta is really going to be driven by the fall velocities of each of the individual grain classes. And so the more grain classes you have, kind of the smoother your delta is going to be. And so subdividing your grain classes does help your model behave more realistically. But kind of a worse outcome than that is that if, say, these are your bed gradations, but then let's say that anywhere else in your model you bring in those blank gradations. So let's just go back to the rating curve and say you put in your rating curve data like this. Or really anywhere else in your model, you have gradations coming in these blank grain classes. When that material comes in to this control volume and tries to compute a capacity, it'll look at the bed and see that there's 0 fraction. And so when it multiplies the potential times the fraction, it'll get 0 transport. And so it can really mess up your transport capacity calculations. It can wreak havoc with some of the mixing algorithms. And so, even if you only have data at this coarser resolution, I would recommend going in and interpolating or making some assumption about what is in these intermediate grain classes. It's a pretty easy calculation. You can interpolate, you can log interpolate, but go in and actually put in some reasonable assumption for those intermediate grain classes. The other thing you could do is you could go to user-defined grain classes. And here you could go in and say, you know what, I only want to run those particular grain classes. I don't know anything about those intermediate grain classes, so I don't want to interpolate. That wouldn't be my choice, but maybe that's the way you feel about your system. And so what you could do is you could just get rid of them. You could get rid of the intermediate grain classes. So for example, if you have very fine sand but not fine sand, you could get rid of fine sand, move medium sand up here, and then make this fine sand go from 0.625 to 0.25. And then the medium sand will go from 0.25 to 1. And again, I don't recommend this. Generally, if I'm going to go one direction or the other with editing my grain classes, usually I'll subdivide them. Like in some cases, you know, if there's a system that's like 80% very fine sand, what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll subdivide those very fine sand grain classes into 3 separate grain classes so I can get some resolution there. But if you wanted to do a coarser resolution model on your gradations, you could do this, and what that would do is that would enforce a constraint that the model would never bring in a gradation that isn't in your bed. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is you want to definitely have smooth gradations. Don't leave any blanks in your bed gradations, and have them transition. And also, you know, go in and put in a 0 point and a 100 point. If you were to say develop a model that looked like this, you know, the model's going to go in and assume that this is 100 and assume that this is 0, but it's just a little sloppy. So just, you know, make sure that your reviewers know that you're making conscious decisions and not leaving things up to the model to guess. Okay, so the bed gradation can actually be input in several ways. You know, the bed gradation often comes from like sieve analysis, which is a very geotechnical analysis. And so we generally think about that in a cumulative distribution function, or the percentage finer than a particular grain class, where on the x-axis you have the grain size in a log scale, and on the y-axis you have percent finer. You know, many people who came into sediment transport through, say, civil engineering and hydraulic engineering, you took a geotech class, you've run the sieves, and so you're used to reporting things in this way. It's actually a little bit more intuitive. Instead of having a cumulative distribution function, or a CDF, it's just have a PDF, a probability distribution function, or a histogram of what's in each of these bins. Then you don't have to kind of do the math in your head of, you know, what's percent finer of this grain class. Well, the percent finer is the material that's actually finer of the upper bound of the grain class, but that gets a little confusing. So it's more intuitive to just switch to a probability distribution function. That's what this button right here does. It switches between the percent finer and grain class percent. Or you can put this in as a decimal point, as a fraction. I don't recommend that you do, because percent finer actually needs whole numbers that go up to 0. The grain class percent will normalize, but if you want to move back and forth, I don't recommend that you do that. So these should probably add up to 100. But here's the second mistake that people make, and that is that this editor, you can put things in either format. The other editor, the Flux editor, is not that flexible. And so if you go to boundary conditions and you open the Flux editor, you'll see that this is not percent finer. This is actually comparable to the fractions. And so these should add up to 100, or in this case, I put them in as decimals, so they should add up to 1. It kind of doesn't matter because we're going to normalize anyways, but you'll notice that there is no percent finer function for this. And so you could imagine what would happen if you defined these as percent finer. Well, it would go in and it would look at fine gravel that would have 100 for 100%, and it would say, oh, this grain class has the most material of all of the grain classes, when in fact it only has 1% of the material. And so this really isn't the user's fault. You know, I've made one of these tools flexible and the other one I haven't. This actually follows the old HEC-6 convention. So, you know, it's based on a convention that's been around since the 70s or 80s. Future versions will be flexible, but it's still incumbent on the user to know what the data format is for the different forms. The bed gradation can be in percent finer or percent of each grain class, whereas the flux gradation really needs to be either a percent or decimal or fraction of each grain class. Which leads me to the third and final, and really the most common mistake that I see with respect to gradations in a sediment transport model. And that is that one of these data types are much more common than the other. Let me just pause for a second. Can you guess which of these is more common? Is it the bed gradations or the flux gradations? Well, it is, in fact, the bed gradations. If you guessed bed gradations, you're correct. And that's because bed gradations, you can just go out there with a shovel or some sort of drag bucket. If it's a deep river, there are definitely conventions to do this well. But there's just a lot of different ways to collect bed gradations, and also you can collect them in real time. You can collect them associated with low flows, whereas flux gradations are much harder to get. You need a boat, you need like some sort of isokinetic sampling fish, and then they have to be opportunistic. You have to go out there and get them at moderate and even high flows in addition to low flows. And so really, you can go out and get bed gradations at the beginning of a study, but at the beginning of the study, there are either flux gradations or there aren't, and you probably aren't going to be able to get a lot more during the course of the study. Bed gradations are much more common than flux gradations, which leads to the third major blunder that I see in model gradation data. And that's that, a lot of times modelers won't have these data at all. And so they'll get to this point in the model and they'll say, oh, the model is asking me for a gradation. Well, I have a gradation. I have bed gradations. And so what I could do is I could just pop those in there. Okay, what is almost always true? In fact, I can't think of a reason when it isn't. Go ahead and put it in the comments if you can. But what is almost always true about flux gradations relative to bed gradations? Flux gradations are almost always much, much finer than bed gradations. And so if you get to this part of the model and say, well, I need a gradation for my flux, and I have gradation, I went out and collected it with a drag bucket. And so what I could do is I could just turn this into the grain class fraction and go in and put it in here. What's going to happen to your model? Well, I actually haven't run this, so this will make an interesting exercise. But I can tell you what I think is going to happen. You've just made the load a lot coarser than it is. And so what's probably going to happen is you're probably going to deposit a bunch of material in that first cross-section, and your model's going to either be completely unrealistic or fail because of maximum bed change. Okay, so let's actually run this model and see how it performs. This is a synthetic model that was in equilibrium, so it runs pretty fast, but is also relatively realistic. Okay, so let's go look at the results. I'm using a developmental version of RAS here, but we're going to look at the sediment output viewer that was new with the 2020 release, which is version 6.0. And what we're going to do is let's just look at the invert change in the profile. And then let's look at the last time step and see what happened. Aha! Well, that's right. The model didn't fail because the flux that's coming in is actually relatively small, but all of the sediment deposited at that first cross-section. And that's because the bed gradation is much coarser than the flux gradation. And so just using the bed gradation for the flux gradation, you're going to deposit in that first cross-section. This was like a 3-month model, so you could imagine that if you ran this over the course of a 50-year simulation, that eventually that cross-section would just fill up, the model would fail, or worse yet, the model wouldn't fail, you wouldn't notice, and then you've just got a trash model that you're going to make predictions with. And so this is why you actually have to make some solid estimate of what those flux gradations are. I mentioned in some of the other videos, we've written a paper about estimating these flux gradations. It can be useful to look for these data on adjacent or similar systems. And if you just don't have any information about these flux gradations, and I've been in that situation before, then it becomes your least certain, most sensitive parameter. And I will do a video eventually on calibration. But here's like the crux of calibration, is that the parameters that you should be adjusting during the calibration process are those that are most sensitive and least certain. And so in these cases where you don't have good flux gradation data, or say any flux gradation data, well, then you are going to adjust that to make your model calibrate. And let's say this was my first guess. I would look at that and I would say, I'm comfortable with my transport function. I'm comfortable with the mass of my flux, but the river's not doing this. The river's not depositing in that upstream cross section. And so my flux gradation is just too coarse. I'm just going to fine that up until the model is behaving the way the prototype behaves. Okay, so those are 3 of the most common mistakes that I see surrounding the process of entering gradations in the sediment model in HEC-RAS. We'll do a few more of these troubleshooting videos. I certainly learn chess best by counterexample and watching how other people fail. And so hopefully this video will help you avoid some of these failure modes and develop your own set of best practices for sediment transport modeling.